Indigenous Perspectives session. My name is Hilding Nielsen. I am a professor in the Department of Physics at Memorial University of Newfoundland and Labrador. If you don't know where Newfoundland and Labrador is, start from the eastern seaboard of the United States, go north along the coast until you hit Greenland, and then double back a bit. I'm also Mi'kmaq from Dadmaguk. Dadmaguk is the Mi'kmaq word for the island of Newfoundland. Being here today is a very nice experience for me, but it is worth acknowledging that I'm at one end of a heat wave. My colleagues are at other ends of a heat wave today. We're facing the climate change in its onset. I'm in a province where we just had an evacuation of communities due to wildfire. And of course, we live in a world where we are dealing with onsets of genocides in Congo, Myanmar, Palestine, and elsewhere. So environmental justice is almost to discuss this is almost a privilege at this point. So I hope we can have a productive discussion, and I will invite my colleagues to introduce themselves. We're currently, one of my colleagues who will be joining us is running a little late, unfortunately. So hopefully when you see him pop up, we'll have time to introduce him as well. So luckily, my colleagues' first names are all early in the alphabet, so we'll start alphabetically. Bridget, would you introduce yourself first, as you prefer?
Sure. Wahiko Ban. Good morning. My name is Bridget Kimsey, or Obsit Memekas. I am of the Delaware Tribe of Indians. I'm also with admission privileges inside of the Cherokee Nation. Trying to think, Hawanishita. Thank you so much for being here, for holding this space, and for all that has come into play to have this space. I think Hilding says it correctly. This is a real privilege to be able to talk about this with so much else going on. My background, I'm a graduate student finishing up my master's in space studies and astronomy. I will continue on with my PhD in artificial intelligence in the fall. But I've been inside of global Indigenous methods and Western scientific methods working together, and how they don't work together for the last 30 years. My work has mostly been in healthcare and oncology medicine, working in ambulatory hospital settings. So really working with the human animal for 30 years from multiple medical lineages from around the world has really informed how I also look at care of land and care of space and all of our relatives here and everywhere, including subatomic particles. So that's very close to my heart. And if you want to learn more about me, that's in the profile. Always feel free to reach out, but I am an author, researcher, consultant, and teacher at the University of Vermont. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm also with NASA, sorry. I'm a solar system ambassador with NASA. So if you do have any questions on that front, please let me know.
Oh, thank you. Elena.
Well, hello, everyone. My name is Elena Chirkovic. I am Canadian citizen, naturalized, not living in Canada for many years, currently living in Denmark, not Danish, obviously, I guess, originally from the Balkans, what is now called Bosnia. So thank you for the invitation. And by no means can I, it was a little bit awkward when I said North American Indigenous people, so not being neither North American or Indigenous in any way to North America. Although I've lived there for what, maybe 15 to 20 years before leaving, but I work for my PhD in Toronto at Osgoode Hall Law School, Indigenous people context of mining resource, and environmental assessment and international law, national law, and so on. So I worked quite a lot on that level of kind of at institutional level on how these things interact with each other. So that is the one perspective with which I come today. But right now, I'm working mostly in outer space law, and here in Aarhus, I'm at Aarhus University. I also work in climate constitutionalism with a colleague. So that is more or less, I think, my background, professional and otherwise.
Thank you. Thank you both for agreeing to participate in this panel today. To start, I'd like to kind of acknowledge, I invited as well DeAndre Smiles from the University of Victoria, who hopefully will make it to join us soon. But the purpose in inviting these three wonderful people is to have a diverse set of perspectives, both academic and internationally. So Elena and I have worked together, broadly speaking, around Indigenous rights in space, because Elena has one of the deepest knowledges I know in Canadian law around Indigenous rights and acting in space law, as well as, Bridget works with NASA and space development and lots of these things. And DeAndre has talked about geographies of space. And together, I think that allows us to have a very rich perspectives of space and ethics and environmental justice in ways that sometimes tends to be ignored. I always remember something called the SATCON-1, which is the satellite conference from the American Astronomical Society, who talked about the ethics of space exploration, noting that Hawaiians might not be able to navigate if there are too many satellites in space without actually speaking to a native Hawaiian.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it's important that we, in these discussions, is to have a very modern and developed set of perspectives. So with that in mind, I'll invite Bridget to offer her thoughts on this important topic.
Oh boy. I'm going to try to stay focused here. One thing I've really been coming into through my 2.5 years working on my master's and being able to go to some really amazing national and international conferences on space and the development from a government, non-government, university, profit, nonprofit, private, you get my idea, around the world, is getting a lot of insight of what's happening in discussions and networking. And and looking at my medical background as well. And so having that together from biology to astrophysics, Indigenous, and biology to astrophysics, modern Western. And again, these are my experiences and what I've been exposed to. So I just want to keep that. I'm not speaking for all Indigenous people here, right? But one thing I have seen is you have modern Western science and you have Indigenous science. These two things can speak well to each other if given the opportunity. Now, Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous wisdom are separate things. If I think of the Big Bang coming in, you've got 33,000 years, Australian Aboriginals going back 33,000 years, really strong Indigenous wisdom connected deeply to the earth and to many other aspects of physics, time, and space, including the space that we are in, Earth, our ecosystem of our solar system. We go down into Indigenous knowledge about 5,000 years in, as other things are coming up and need to be addressed. And then that same information can be distilled just into Indigenous science, where the modern Western science, people's brains that are neurowired in that predominantly can understand it and work together. There is no modern Western knowledge yet, and there is no modern Western wisdom. What I notice that is happening on many fronts in many industries, because evolution in technology has been with us the whole entire time. In fact, I give a good argument for why hybrid intelligence, modern Western calls it artificial, has been with us for 300,000 years. What I'm saying is the missing factor here is the knowledge. We can't keep creating in a way that is destroying our home. Name me any other animal on this planet that does this. Name me any other celestial body or ecosystem that does this. We are living embodiments of Earth walking around. So as an 18,000-year-old animal that hasn't changed much, what the hell are we doing? That's my question, and that's what I present out there. Because when we get real simple on a lot of stuff, even in the creation of anything, taking subatomic particles and molecules and enslaving them in tools that there's been no discussion about, how does this work? You help me, I help you. What are we creating together in nature? Because nothing is artificial in creation. That can't possibly be. Physics tells us that. So what are we doing when we have colonialism 1.0 did not go well on Earth? We're all sitting here in heat waves, understanding that the structural constructions aren't working too well. And now we're going to take this on the road into space with colonialism 2.0 and artificial intelligence 3.0. Are we okay with continuing colonialism? Because if we build structures in situ in space that require water from the moon and material from asteroids, how is this not the same extracting tools we've been doing on Earth with things that will run out? Why not pay attention to how ecosystems work? Why not be humble and go back to science and the scientific method and actually really listen, where you are not subject to what a government, a media, or a death threat from a citizen who doesn't understand you drives the research bus, let us say. And so I guess in a very concise way, trying to keep it into a framework here, those are just my beginning remarks of we have entered firmly into colonialism 2.0. And I can give you 100 examples in the last 2.5 years of what I have seen on multiple levels of why this is the case. So,
Well, thank you.
opening remark.
Thank you. And that came out, that was a strong opening remark. So
I try.
I very much appreciate that. Elena, would you like to add to that?
Yes, sorry. So it is interesting to talk about knowledge and spaces of knowledge, modern, not modern, Western, and so on. And for me, this was particularly not challenging or necessarily interesting. It was just an experience because I've moved a lot around the world. I'm kind of perpetually displaced from a place that I'm from, and here and there, I'm meeting a lot of different people. And my discipline and my education and everything is in our standard modern Western university, as I'm sure is the case with all of us, actually. And so because I have been working quite a lot on environmental issues, and now more recently, so I maybe this is something to sort of backtrack a little bit, because I said in my introduction, I did my PhD on Indigenous people's rights and whatever, and law, and this is something that I would mention. But I don't work on that specifically right now for a number of reasons. It is not, I can speak about the law, but the experience of the people is not my story to tell. There are all sorts of representational issues. I also have other interests, so to speak, but I work a lot on these questions of post-human, modern planetary, human, non-human, etc. relations, and Earth system science or systems approaches, etc. And also what is the case with outer space. And in fact, just today I was at another conference on law and global issues in law and new challenges and so on. And there's quite a lot of reference to, for example, Latour, actor network theory, post-human theories, and so on. But as one of our actually colleagues from Canada, Zoe Todd, mentioned in one of her papers, that I can send this to people if they're interested, it's now some years old, where she said when she met Latour when he was still alive, and she went and heard his talk, and she's Canadian First Nation, so I don't know from where exactly, but she was saying, I was listening to him speak and I was thinking, but this is also, he's never once mentioned any non-Western knowledge. So he's never mentioned, I don't know, the Inuit, the whatever. And then she started to reflect on herself and her own background and her own knowledge. And what reading that and spending so much time in academia, one thing, I was going to talk about the law, but now I'm talking about knowledge, is that what I still find very challenging is when I'm speaking about all of these topics, and if I want to speak about, let's say, First Nations knowledge to the best, to the level that I can actually know it and understand it, and I refer to what is published, for example. So people like Zoe Todd, people like John Burroughs, and there's a plethora of colleagues there, Glenn Colpart, and so on. I refer to them as I would refer to Latour, right? Or as I would refer to any other legal scholar, to Martti Koskiniemi, never mind, I don't, nobody in space maybe knows who that is, and so on. But I always somehow have to have that qualification, and this is Indigenous scholars, and this is Indigenous scholarship, or this is something or other. And so I ask myself, do I say this is a French perspective, this is the German perspective, or whatever? I mean, we do sometimes mention that there are, schools, but it's not seen in the same way. Mm-hmm. And so to maybe just to give a little bit then to get into law, where what we see also in the Canadian law, and I will set aside international, there is that also question of what is standard, modern, Western, formal that we all practice in, and that other stuff that somehow comes in. And to go back to John Boros, he wrote a paper in, I think maybe in 2017 or 18, on various decisions, the Supreme Court of Canada, and an entire history of up until then of these decisions, and how, and I'll say the word Aboriginal because that's the word he uses, how Aboriginal rights and title became historicized, how it all kind of has to go back into history to justify itself, and then it has to meet at the point of contact, so at the point of colonialism and that experience and the treaty making and so on. So there is also an element of this kind of tension where certain things are, and I see this a lot on this side of the ocean, by the way, on other continents, that whenever I speak of Indigenous rights, it's a little bit like, I don't know, some cartoons or novels by German authors from 1960s or whatever. I'm making stuff up because I don't know the exact, but I have it in an image in my head of what I'm trying to refer to, so that it's something historical and cultural and spiritual and so on. Mm. And so in the contemporary outer space debates that we have and discussions, and you mentioned Satcon Hilding, but like in other institutions and in other spaces where we talk about outer space law, because I'll talk about it as my discipline. And then when we start to talk about Indigenous rights or participation or whatever, I see that again, that we talk specifically about some kind of other knowledge, something that's mystical, spiritual, cultural, connected to some kind of almost personal practice. And it's good to involve it, but it's not the issue at hand, like the principal issue at hand. And that's where, that's at least what I have been doing, is to try and dig out the actual law and to speak so Bridget, you talked about how the two intertwined, are intertwined or should be intertwined or whatnot. But what I'm trying to sometimes do is say, okay, so I will step back from all that knowledge culture. It's not my culture, it's not my knowledge. I actually know very little about anything when it comes to actual, individual First Nations and their practices. But I will just talk about the Canadian law and international law, and I will tell you where there is the law. There is a treaty. There is the question of self-determination. There is a question of sovereignty or governance and all these kinds of things. So that when we talk about dark and quiet skies, or when we're talking about any other issue or lunar exploration and exploitation and so on, yes, there are all kinds of ethical reasons why it should be inclusive and why there should be wider communication. But it is wrong to assume that it is also something that is just cultural out there and not a matter of hard law.
Right.
Because we do have hard law as well. So I'll maybe stop there. And
if I can just jump on one thing you're saying, what I'm proposing, because when I've been able to distill, I am not an authorized carrier. I can't speak for, I'm still a knowledge bearer. I'm not quite old enough to be an elder, and maybe that won't be my path at all. But I have been trained very heavily from 0 to 24 years old. And then that training has continued in various fashions. What I have learned is that any amount of Indigenous knowledge is not going to be understood by a modern Western dominant brain that is neurowired in a modern dominant Western language. That's just is not going to happen right now. But I see it moving towards there. And that's when I get excited. I almost feel like my role, if I choose to take it, is more like midwifing, helping to translate information, knowledge, wisdom into an indigenous scientific model. Let's look at the science of animal drugs. Let's look at the science of the complex structural system for this governing body. Let's look at the science behind how the Mayans did X, Y, and Z. And let's look at the science on where the nebula, like, I don't want to piss off, no offense, any elders. I'm just trying to say, let's keep that's their knowledge. That's their wisdom. What's the modern Western knowledge and wisdom? I believe in it. I do. I honestly do. I love physics. I love what I can do and appropriate from the tools from physics and then use it in Indigenous knowledge and wisdom. It's awesome and exciting. It's just that I don't really have anyone to share with some of this stuff that what I find, except in my own personal writing that I share in books, because it's like Indigenous is like, wait, how is that? And modern Western is like, wait, and then they see. And so it's a very, I feel what you're saying inside of law, and I'll stop talking now, but like, I'm just really trying to find that non-polarizing, where do we come together that people feel safe, both modern Western science and Indigenous science, and help y'all move into, including myself, because I'm Scandinavian, move into, modern Western knowledge. So yes, I don't know if that helps at all. I just wanted to dovetail on that.
Thank you both. DeAndre has managed to join us. I'm glad you were able to make it. Would you like to take a moment to introduce yourself, and then maybe you can build up on the previous discussions that you heard?
Yeah, good morning, folks. Apologies. I'm in the midst of teaching an internship on Black and Indigenous geographies here in Ohio. I'm calling in from the campus of Ohio State University. So a lot of moving parts, and so I apologize for being a little late this morning, but I'm happy to be a part of this. My name is Neo Kamigabo DeAndre Smiles. I'm a citizen of the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe, and I'm an assistant professor of geography at the University of Victoria, which is located in BC, Canada. I do a lot of different work, primarily in the areas of critical Indigenous geographies and human-environment interactions, and have done a small but growing amount of work in Indigenous geographies of outer space. And so I'll try my best. I feel like there's probably a provocation that came before I joined the call. But kind of talking about like how is it that we can reconcile Indigenous knowledge and like Western science. One of the things that I'll kind of gently push back on is there's always this kind of move. There's generally this kind of sense that in dominant science, Indigenous knowledge needs to be made legible for dominant science, right? Like people are like, well, I don't get this. Like, how can you put this in terms that I can understand? Which is where, speaking as a critical human geographer, then you have to like use like Foucault and Marx and Latour and all these different folks as interlocutors. And one of the things I've said is like, what would it look like for literacy to grow in dominant science towards Indigenous knowledge, right? And so it's not less that I have to make my work legible through European philosophers or European scientists, right? But instead, maybe somebody has to read Leroy Little Bear or Zoe Todd or Kim Tallbear or somebody else in order to become more literate in kind of our science, right? Because that's one of the things is that people think that Indigenous knowledge is separate from science. It is not. Actually, one of my biggest critiques is that people think science is like an object, right? That they think it is like a physical thing rather than a process of discovering knowledge, which is actually what the scientific process is all about, right? And people think they're like, oh, well, since it is a thing, right, and not a process, it's neutral and it's, apolitical. And it's like, well, it is not neutral. It's not apolitical. As a matter of fact, I'm building off the Latour. Actually, the way that we do science is very heavily influenced by our own conceptions of the world. And so, like, when it comes to like outer space exploration, dominant science will say like, well, can we do it? Is it possible? Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous science would ask the same question: is it possible? Is this something that we should do? But also it'll be like, well, why are we doing this in the first place, right? What is it about this that drives us in order to do this kind of work? And so I think that a lot of issues could be better addressed, I think, if we kind of flip the script and kind of approach it from kind of a viewpoint of like, how is it that we look past these dominant frameworks into other frameworks and try to make ourselves more cognizant of these sorts of things rather than constantly having to filter things through a Western or dominant viewpoint, which can actually lead to a dilution of what they're trying to say, right? I really like Leroy Little Bear for this actually, because he's incredibly smart by any metric possible, right? I mean, the man can talk about metaphysics and talk about thermodynamics in the same sentence and make it sound absolutely amazing, right? But he also can tie this into his own people's knowledge in a way that it's like, wow, I've never thought about this before in this kind of a way. He gave a talk at the Ecological Society of America conference in Montreal a couple of years ago, and it probably was one of the best talks I've ever been at, right? Because he talked about kind of the metaphysics or the spiritual nature of like doing science, and that's something that we don't focus on enough. So that's kind of what was going through my head as I listened to what was going before, but also if that's another thread that we want to pick up, I'm happy to kind of let that lay there and hear what other people have to say.
Well, thank you. I think so far it's been, I think, a very tremendous discussion about why we go to space, whose knowledge goes to space, and I think also whose rights go to space as part of this. And so I don't know if Eamon would like to pick up on any of those threads or anything they've heard so far. I will note that there is a Q&A. If there's time, we will have some moderate questions. So you please, if anybody in the audience does want to ask anything in the Q&A, please do so. But please, if
Well, I was just gonna I really like what you said, and I'm gonna review back Leroy Littlebear's work. Thank you for that reminder. My situation, and again, maybe I'm dating myself, but in every conversation I've had, I also don't feel safe talking about deeper aspects of Indigenous knowledge, whether that's, obviously for me, I obviously know the science is there already. I don't need to, and I don't feel like trying to prove that to anyone. So I guess my thing is coming from the legacy of Indian boarding schools and huge amount of trauma. And the only way I can describe it, because it's still happening in Indian country, I'm still helping to bury, murdered, missing Indigenous people. This is still happening. So, it clouds my brain in being able to think properly. So when I come back to talking about distilling and talking about Indigenous science and allowing modern Western scientists to have the aha, I figured it out, meanwhile, knowing that that was figured out a long time ago, that feels safer to me than to try to bring in knowledge. And I do credit that, but having the trauma legacy that I'm in can only be described as other genocides and family that either 50 years after it, it's hard to describe. I think if you're Ojibwe, it is hard to describe, but I think we all find our ways, and our age makes a difference. Because I'm older, I just saw some different things maybe that other people who maybe are younger, but they have their own things. So I love that idea of coming either or. And I do think, there's that right. And Dan Hawk brings this up a lot about how Native Indigenous education for space was really cut out from the budget. He goes, not me, he goes into that hard. And so when you have 50 years, 60 years with no Indigenous Native American Indian involvement really, except for, I don't know, I was sort of horrified by what Dan Hawk brought forth as truth, which is truth. And I was like, does anyone else know this? That we got shuffled into like healthcare and this and that, but not space, not the hard sciences, So I think there's an injustice there, because now as things are speeding along, there isn't that Native Indigenous representation that should be there, that we see in healthcare, development of medicine, other areas as well currently, and also in forest management and ecological management on Earth.
Can I just quickly, before I forget, just jump on that, because there are two points. One is, so, I mean, we all started to speak quite a lot, and then we kept using the words modern. And I'll give maybe a small anecdote where we were discussing international law and geopolitics with a colleague of mine. And I made a comment that, oh, well, so many of the things we're discussing right now, well, decades ago, my grandmother said, be careful, because the way things were in, I don't know, 1800s are still the way they are now. It might not appear that way, but there are certain things that still hold true. And she meant it in regard to, let's say, gender, age, and I think it was mostly some kind of, advice to a little girl kind of thing. But so I said that to him, and he said, well, your grandma said it before Latour, and we have never been modern. And so this literally happened this morning. That's why I'm mentioning it. But it's because we're not talking so much about the modern, but I think that, and not I think, but it's also, quite out there already, that in itself is a question as to when we're talking about whatever is dominant, whatever is mainstream and formal and so on. So this myth of modernism and myth of, let's say, myth of modern law, and here I'm citing literally a book, directly, the title of a book, The Myth of Modern Law, that when you look back into the histories of science and law and whatever, all these disciplines that, let's say, we will refer to in this conversation today as, let's say, Western modern something or other, if you go deeper into that history back, you realize that there are deep connections to things that we might consider, we would say, are not modern or pre-modern or whatever those may be. So I won't go maybe into too much detail there. But yeah, so I just wanted, because it's not, I don't think that any of us believe that specifically, that there's that divide. It's just that, you know, as we speak, we're talking about indigenous and then modern and modern, but is it really itself? So that just a comment there.
I think it comes back to neuroscience. You know, I mean, that 0 to 7 formation time. And there's enough studies on that the language and the culture you grow up in will shape how you see and interact with the world. So to change that almost hard wiring at 25, 30, 40, this is a hard call. And even people like a fish in a fishbowl aren't going to see the water. And I know that there are people doing, and people who are engaged, like, I want to see the water. I want to see outside the water. I want to see more, you know, I want to see the full picture. And they do their due diligence, man. They go hard. And there are those that are helping them. I find it to be humiliating and embarrassing, lots of aggressions, microaggressions, as well as sexual assault. If I try to speak about things that are close to my heart, and if I don't meet them at a modern Western language and in a modern Western dominant culture, that if you are part of the Romance languages or part of a language that has been used in colonialism, you are already wired into that. That is just basic biology at this point. That can be worked with, that can be changed. But I'm putting on my healthcare provider hat at this point, and I'm just saying that there's so many neuroscientific studies that do show that it's not meant to be. It's just like when someone inherits anything, right? You inherited something, and it will take a little more effort than I think those that prescribe and their first language is inside of a colonial language. It's going to take a little time. And I think patience with ourselves, patience with others, but also putting boundaries up so more destruction doesn't continue. I do think that there is more offering. Please come tell us. But a lot of the times it starts to feel extracting, and it's not meant to be. That's not the intent, but it happens because that's the only thing that animal knows and was raised in. You see where I'm going? That's what I'm experiencing it.
Sorry,
That's okay.
talked about, I just wanted to say absolutely that.
Oh no. Come back to us.
Oh, and not just on many different topics. I think I'm froze a bit. Yes, mine.
No.
Got it. No, but it's that idea that we would like to include, we want to get participation of, we want to ask and interview and experience, but it feels like some kind of momentary academic tourism and also extraction. And this is, I say, we are now speaking of indigenous peoples, but this is also the case in so many other issues, in kind of unequal relationship where so-called marginalized communities and peoples and so on are meant to be invited and so on. But then when you see the place of decision making, who is inviting, who is deciding, who is making that choice to invite, it's not anyone from those communities. It is from the more, I don't know, for lack of a better word, without prejudice, powerful. I can't come up with a better
That's why
word.
I go in incognito, because I can pass as white. And that's the truth. My grandma told me that early on. She's like, you can pass as white, use it. And I don't know, like, am I adding to the problem here now? You know, at 51, I've seen a lot of stuff in that vein. And my family instructed me to pass as white as often as I can, as hard as I can, for as long as I can, for my own safety.
Thank
So,
you.
you know, I'm just going to move right in there on that modern Western science and say what I got to say from an indigenous science. But there's a lot of fear, I think, in people speaking up, and I think it's justified. And I really credit the young ones who are just like, I don't care, I'm just going for it, you know. But anyway, yes, thank you, Hilding. Sorry.
Thank you. There was a hand raised. I'm gonna, if you do have questions or comments, I would ask you to use the Q&A feature to type it in. DeAndre, would you have anything you would like to add?
Yeah, I think it's one of these things where I think Bridget kind of raises kind of an interesting kind of dynamic, right? Where there's this tension between, trying to protect knowledges that might be sensitive, right? Where with the need to ensure that they're still surviving. And I think this is something that we grapple with in my community. You know, and one of the things I guess I tend to be kind of a bit on the other side. And I mean, I'm 2 generations removed from boarding school survivors. And it's one of these things where, we're in this situation where we're starting to re-embrace these knowledges, but we also want to make sure that they're not being co-opted and used in kind of harmful ways. And I think that really comes down to kind of making sure that we do a lot to help ensure that these knowledges are made available for our own people, right? And making sure that education kind of goes there. I mean, you mentioned, about the fact that like there's not a lot of folks in the outer space sphere who are Indigenous. Yeah, I totally agree with that. It's been a struggle that I've often had to make these kind of decisions about, well, do I work with this person because or do I not? Because it's clear that they kind of view me as like an person to check a box on their work saying that there's an Indigenous person there, right? And they view my knowledge as being more important than, my safety as a person. But I also deal with kind of the reality that like if we don't pass this stuff on, if we secrete it away and don't at least allow some sharing, in some kind of careful circumstances, that knowledge will die, right? And so I don't know if there's really a full answer. It was just kind of a thought that I had about this, right? And I think, one of the things, why I like using the word dominant science, which is something from like Michelle Murphy and Max Lieberman, is to point to the fact that like people call it modern science. Well, modernity really in itself is kind of the idea that Europe kind of created its conception of self and positioned non-Europeans as an other from which they could kind of make themselves feel superior, right? That is kind of the critical definition of modernity. And it also really doesn't speak to the fact that a lot of people seem to come around to Indigenous knowledge nowadays, right? There's no shortage of people that win grants and awards. Like, look at this discovery I made, and then an Indigenous community is like, well, we've been doing that for hundreds of years, but when we told you about it, you said that was primitive and like that it wouldn't work. I'm reminded of a job interview I had once, where I was interviewing at a Canadian university, not the one I'm at now, but another one. And I kind of actually, going off of kind of this need to kind of protect knowledge, I told people about like how I take community safety and like safety of knowledge into like the work that I do. And like in that case, I didn't name the community I worked with, and a professor pulled me aside and said, well, in modern science and actual science, you would never be allowed to obscure the sources of your data like this. And I'm like, well, okay, have you ever done an anonymous survey or any kind of like public health or like private health information? But again, it kind of comes back to this idea of like, why is it that we seek knowledge, right? Is it something to be extracted from, or is it something to actually be in relation to and actually kind of, grow with and allow it to kind of inform our own growing, right? Which kind of, I think, gets into Jamie Johnson's question, right, about kind of learning in a way that doesn't merely use the understood. I think it's something where we don't, one of the answers I would have is like not viewing the knowledge as just the sole objective, right, but using it as a launching point to guide our own learning. So at the sake of not rambling on for too long, I'll stop there.
Thank you. And since you brought up the question, I will just read it out loud and give everyone else an opportunity to address it. So Jamie writes, the balance of understanding for the sake of respect and understanding for the sake of learning strikes me as importantly different topics. I am at the early phase of learning about the cultures of my grandmother, bracket, a Filipino war bride, bracket, and what being a displaced islander can bring to the space exploration table. How does one develop respectful understanding? That is understanding that doesn't merely use the understood. So would anyone like to kind of address that question head on?
Oh, I like to. I think I use the same principles I used in my effectiveness in oncology medicine and in working with different pathologies and people, which was I meet them where they're at. And I have no agenda except to do no harm. And I really spend a lot of my time listening and then trying to figure out a treatment protocol that will work. So I bring that also into this as well, knowing that most humans want health for themselves and their family and other people. And we all have awarenesses, experiences that can be translated into creating research studies or studies that may help bring us information for problems we're having issues with. So I really like to start with, if I'm talking with someone and I'm trying to explain my experience or possibly a scientific data point they may be missing in a way that they'll understand. I'm really, at NYU, an undergrad, I was really taken with the work of Shirley Bryce Heath, who found a way to help with illiterate children in Appalachia and really worked with them in their environment. So I very much embrace where we are at right now with climate change, things falling, things not working, and really present data like you want to do X, Y, and Z. Well, does that make sense when you say X, Y, and Z? And often the modern Western engineer will go, oh, that does not. So I try to find a way, if that makes, I'm not sure if that helps, but I really try to keep it exactly to who. So if you're, I think if I heard that correctly, a displaced islander, and you have some real issue, you have some real say about like, this is not going to work, this isn't going to work. If you are looking to get into that space, can you communicate, at least in that forum, in a way that you can be heard? And then if you want to explore it more, maybe in another way. I don't know if I'm making sense, but I'm trying to loop it back to where you will actually be heard and gain movement in the direction you want in the space industry and with space officials.
Can I ask a question? And this is kind of a question for everyone. So non-Indigenous context. So when we a meeting X in an institution Y, and me or someone else proposes or wants to discuss, let's say, outer space activities in the context of, and I speak of rights because, again, law, of, let's say, Indigenous people's rights and practices, or rights in treaty, rights in Canada, rights in title, whatever. And if the response from that audience or that institute is, this is not relevant to our issues at hand, which are anything ranging from, and Hilding, actually, you might be better at this because you're in science. So if, if you're like in an astronomy, you were talking about, what would you answer?
Unfortunately, I think you broke up a few times there, and we kind of missed the heart of your question, or at least I did.
So, I mean, I post this question sometimes, but then I sort of leave the room because I mentioned something like Indigenous rights, not being Indigenous. The answer is that question or that topic is not relevant. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay. So that topic is not relevant to our space or our issues at hand or whatever we're discussing right now, be it outer space law at UNCOPUS and I don't know what, security or whatever, or astronomy and research. And I mentioned, Hilding, you might know more about this when you go in and say something like, oh, what about, rights of First Nations? And the answer is, we're talking about astronomy. We're talking about science. We're talking about research, scientific research. Your question is not relevant because the assumption is that somehow that question is related to something completely unrelated to, let's say, astronomy or physics or tax. I don't know. I'm making
Yeah. So
do you answer?
So if I could repeat your question, because just in case anybody missed parts of it, it's how do you talk about Indigenous rights in a room where people think it's relevant or not germane to the discussion, i.e. astronomy or physics, Indigenous versus Indigenous rights. And if I can interject my own thoughts, my first thing that popped in my mind was the United Nations questioning the nation of Canada over its goal of building a 30-meter telescope on Mauna Kea against the rights of Indigenous peoples. So, we could, astronomy as a field or as a industry could ignore Indigenous rights, but Indigenous rights are going away. And I think this also brings me to something I would like to kind of ask everyone here. We see environmental justice movements like Mauna Kea, Defense of Mauna Kea, like Standing Rock, like Winnistoten, like 1492 Landback Lane in Southern Ontario, and more. And many of these environmental justice movements end up in violence from police or settler communities. What does an environmental justice movement that supports Indigenous peoples look for in an outer space industry? And maybe this may address a little bit of Brad Tapp's question about damages by space exploitation that might be more visible from Indigenous perspectives, but not from sympathetic Eurocentric scholars.
Mhm.
So I'll start with DeAndre, if you don't mind.
Right. So that's a really, really good question that Brad poses, right? Because there are these certain things, right, where people they don't view they take a look at environmental damage or colonial damage, and they only view it as the things that are very visible, right? Where like, oh, if you're putting a shovel in the ground, or you're building a telescope on top of a mountain, right, or building some kind of infrastructure, that's the kind of harm that they talk about. I think one of the things is that you have to view harm in a bit of a different way, which you have to take a look at harm holistically, right? So from a not just physical harm, but also from a cultural standpoint, from an emotional standpoint, right? From a spiritual standpoint. And so I think that when it comes down to, let's say, Mauna Kea and the 30-meter telescope, right? One of the big, pushes there was that this kind of push and pull between the astronomy community saying, well, we want to build this telescope on Mauna Kea because it's one of the few places in the world that is advantageous to build such a telescope, right? That there are already, I forget the exact number, over a dozen other telescopes on the mountain there, and that this is something that will open up astronomy not only to people around the world, but to Native Hawaiians, right? And then on the other side, you have Kanaka Maoli saying, well, you've already built how many telescopes on the mountain? Do we really need another one? This is a sacred site for us. And a lot of the thought came down to, and the debate came down to, well, the physical construction, right? But it's also like the idea that Kanaka spirituality is viewed as lesser importance than what is viewed as like actionable science, right? It's also kind of yet another step in a long history of American colonial domination of Hawaii, right? That dates back to 1898 and even before then. And so people oftentimes kind of forget about that. They get focused on, with these examples like Unistoten, like Line 3, like Dapple, they think about all these physical kind of viewpoints, right? And it's like, well, harm can happen even beyond that, right? What does it mean when you are essentially told that your own worldview is of lesser importance than scientific knowledge production, right? What does that say about how your knowledge is being viewed in comparison to dominant science, right? And this can be something oftentimes where I find that we kind of lose the thread with sympathetic Eurocentric scholars, right? As they kind of say, they again kind of return to this viewpoint of like, well, science is neutral, right? What is the problem here? Can't we find a way to like work together? But it's like, how do you work together when the stack is already decked against an Indigenous community in so many various ways, right? Where the harm goes just beyond physical destruction of landscape, but also goes all the way down to the heart itself. Which in my mind is something that we don't focus on enough in science. We don't focus on enough about where does the heart come in? Where do love and care come into science, right? We just focus on it as this sterile kind of apolitical kind of process. So that would be my introductory answer to that. I could talk about this for hours and hours.
Can I just give in one sterile comment? And that's governance. I always wonder, from the first-hand experience that we're discussing, or what everyone else would say, what decision making. Talking about outer space now, but years ago when I was in Canada and whatever, discussing something like mining, there would also be certain kinds of interests among First Nations. There are only certain of, regardless of what that might be, what the actual decision making, it's just a sovereignty and ownership to decide, do you want.
I apologize, Elena. We're losing about half of your comments.
I'm going to type it in, but you keep going without me.
So maybe Bridget, you can add to it, and we'll come back to Elena's point.
Sure. I mean, I feel like it's being well addressed. Is there a portion that you think that I could highlight more, or?
I think, we talked about environmental justice on Earth, and I think Elena was coming down to land rights, if I at some level,
Sovereignty,
and sovereignty.
Sovereignty.
And
self-determination,
What
decision making.
What I would love to see is like how the World Health, like how the United Nations was created, then the World Health Organization. I would love to see the World Space Organization. I'm not saying every sovereign nation is going to attend or be part of it, but at least it creates an understanding of how complex this issue is on every front, from a land ownership, who owns the moon, if China get, like I understand if one, well, we won't go there, but you get my idea of how do we update and really get more inclusive in all these different ideas and things that are coming that are no longer just ideas, space tourism and private, non-private, LEO, how is low Earth orbit with the orbits? How is that impacting dark skies? I mean, there's so many topics. So I feel like when we get into anything, World Space Organization and the astronomy, I understand, I think is still within the UN, like they went with the dark skies, like really trying to press to get help with that. The telescope one is really hard. I find that to be very hard to talk about. Again, how do we get with the heart, right? I just know that land that I've walked on for 20 years that knows me, a really intense storm came through and ripped up all those trees, or a lot of them. And I went there the next morning, and it was a very powerful feeling, and a very grieving feeling for a number of months with those trees. And I learned a lot from the trees, and both from what would be accepted by modern Western science and also from knowledge and wisdom on the other side. So it's just, for me, I do have that split for my own safety. But as far as when it comes to putting telescopes on beings, individuals that don't have human faces, we'll say, there's no agency. I just also wonder from a modern Western, like a person, beings who are putting that on there is like, I'm just sitting there scratching my head. I'm like, you do realize this is going to come back to you. Like if this was, I know the whole thing just really makes me, it's re-triggering a trauma. And I have found that again and again in both astronomy and the space studies is how can Indigenous Native peoples come together and discuss? I don't know yet. I haven't figured that out, because I find the whole telescope thing, if that were, it sickens me in my heart and in my gut in a way that's really hard to resolve as I work on an exoplanet research team, if you get my drift. So I'm definitely torn.
Thank you. I'm just going to read Elena's comments. My comment was, or Elena's comment was, in addition to all the levels addressed about environmental and other issues, just autonomy, capacity to decide without in a Canadian context, always having to rely on balancing interests. Here, Elena is specifically citing the Supreme Court of Canada. Or to summarize, the question of sovereignty and governance, and yes, with an understanding of a relational approach, but still the broader topic of autonomy. And I think this is really an important statement here. With a lot of the issues on environmental justice on land or water, it is a question of sovereignty, one that is largely probably not understood, recognized, or even considered for outer space. But having said that, and while I could listen to you all talk all day, we do only have 3 minutes left. So I'm going to thank you all for participating in this webinar, and I'm going to invite our panelists if they want to offer any brief final thoughts.
Just say thank you.
Thank you for having me be a part of this. It was a really just an amazing conversation. I feel like we only scratched the surface of this, right? And it kind of speaks to, this is about just futures in outer space, but it really touches on kind of the underlying themes, right, about science and knowledge production, about whose voices are prioritized, right? And so, for those of you that are kind of curious about how you can engage in this kind of conversation, right, there's a lot of different venues as you can see.
Yeah, I feel, Winishita, thank you so much for having us and for your great hosting, Hilden. Really appreciate everyone here. And for those listening, it is just scratching the surface, but I'm thankful, I learned just even a lot just listening to everyone here. So Winishita, and if always, feel free to reach out and maybe we'll all meet again.
Thank you very much for agreeing to participate, and we'll all lay out to you all, and we'll all lay out to our audience. And I hope we can learn as much from the rest of the conference as I learned here, because this was a very tremendous panel to start us off. So thank you.
Miigwech, everyone. Thank you.
Winishita.